Welcome to Word on the Grid, Bunty.
Thank you. It's good to
Uh,
be here.
Today I'm joined by Bunty Stokes. Bunty is an experienced managing director with a vast career leading consumer brands. Today, Bunty is a managing director who works on a fractional basis, supporting organizations going through transformation, growth, and leadership. So, Bunty, thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
Today, before we launch into your career and leadership, I'm going to ask a simple question. Who is Bunty Stokes?
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this. Bunty Stokes is the eldest of 9 siblings, various degrees of steps and halves, and quite a few marriages. Not me, my parents. Very connected to the family. That's an important piece of the jigsaw for us. We don't have children ourselves, so I am a dog mum to 2 spaniels. And in my work life, I have, as you rightly said, spent 35 years in basically consumer brands and businesses, working my way through the ranks into what now is I guess a culmination of all the skills I've learned over the years, a jack of all trade, master of none, supporting smaller businesses who perhaps can't afford a full-time MD but need an in-house mentor or somebody to help sort of spot some of the things that you don't always spot when you're in the weeds. So two heads. And actually a large friendship group, which I see as an extended family as well. So
Fantastic, fantastic. And just before we started recording the podcast, you were telling me about celebrating your father's 80th birthday this weekend, weren't you? And managing to get the whole family together for one big party celebration.
the one thing about having a dad like my dad, who was a publican, and actually being a publican is in my roots. My grandmother was the longest serving landlady in the land before she passed. So it's in our blood, but also a firm lover of music and socializing generally.
So did you grow up spending a lot of time in pubs as a child?
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents owned a pub. So when I was really little and my mum and my dad first had me, they would literally drop me off at the pub and I would be in a pen for all to see, usually screaming my head off, I was told, needing attention. And then my dad actually was a builder, but his dream was always to have a pub. So while I didn't live with my dad, when he did own the pub, we sort of spent a lot of time going to see the family in the pub, Christmases in the pub, or music venues, going to the live music that he put on in the pub. So yes, it's in our blood, shall we say.
Sounds like you came from a really hard-working family. So, what messages did you receive as a child about power, ambition, success, leadership?
Very little, actually, because my parents were so young. My mum was 19 when she had me. My dad was 22. They divorced when I was 5. And so it was me and my sister. She was 3.5. I was 5 when they divorced. They were so young that they almost weren't parenting us. They were getting by. So actually we became quite independent, almost feral at points, because we just have to take ourselves off. And dad was running a building business, and my mum was obviously at home looking after us. But when we went to my dad's at the weekend, we literally just find ourselves making a den in a field with our next door neighbours. There wasn't really any leadership. It was more about independence. It was more about sort of a much more stoic approach. We knew we were loved, but nobody ever talked about that. When the divorce happened, it was there was a lot of tension because there was a lot of animosity between my mum and dad. If there were any leadership's influence, it was coming from my grandparents because they were ex-military, so they understood the importance of routine and support, where perhaps my parents were too young to really understand that. So that's probably where the independence streak came from, because we were left to get on with it, in most of the time, to escape some of the toxicity that was going on within the divorce, and there was a lot of it. so yeah.
So what you mentioned about your grandparents, but is there anything else that shaped you as a youngster into sort of becoming the leader that you became sort of later into your career?
I think being the big sister meant that, and if you think about how young Sam was, she was 3.5 when they divorced. It's sort of almost, I became a grown up to her because I kind of had some idea of what was going on. And my grandparents trusted me to understand that, because somebody had to, and somebody had to look after my 3.5-year-old sister, and they weren't there all the time. So it was a bit of that. And I think what was interesting is that it's complicated, but our step parents were originally married to each other. They'd both been to university, but nobody else in our family had been to university. So as much as the relationship with my stepdad and my stepmum, my first stepmum, wasn't particularly harmonious because there was a lot of tension going on between everybody, it wasn't an amicable swap, shall we say. It was a complex swap. What that did is sort of exposed me to the possibilities of university and education that perhaps would never have been on my radar through my parents, because they were so young and they hadn't explored that journey themselves. So there was a bit of that, I guess, that exposure. And then also my stepdad had a really good job. That exposed us to travel, a lot of travel, because at some point he worked for Rank Travels. That gave me a bit of a desire to explore traveling, not necessarily in a way that's sort of vocational, really in a way that just you'd be exposed through a career path. And my dad used to do a lot of building work in Great Titchfield Street, Great Portland Street, so the fashion industry. There were a couple of people who were, good old rag trade people who used to travel a lot as well. And there was one woman in particular, a lady called Kath Gray, who always came back from her travels with wonderful trinkets from all over the world and was always immaculately dressed. And I think if there was any influence in terms of not necessarily leadership, but forging a path in fashion, it came from her, because I just wanted to be Kath Gray. I wanted to wear her clothes, and I wanted to travel the way she did. And I wanted all of the trinkets and memories that she was making through things she was bringing back on her travels. And I think that set me on a path to explore fashion, or, business, if you like, leaning into fashion. And actually my mum was really into fashion. She used to make a lot of clothes for us, because we couldn't afford to sort of buy nice clothes when we were really little. And then when she met Peter, my stepdad, we had access to, it was quite a dichotomy of childhood, actually, because with my dad we'd go camping in Norfolk in the pouring rain, and in my mum we'd go to Morocco for the weekend and stay in a fancy hotel. So there was a real dichotomy of experiences as children, and exposure to one created an idea that there were opportunities, and the exposure to the other gave you a grounding, if you like, brought
you back down to earth.
Exactly grounded you.
Yeah.
So it was a good balance, really.
Yeah.
And, my dad was always surrounded by lots of friends and family, and was very much family orientated, and wasn't, not at all into the trappings of luxury or anything like. My mum, who had met Peter, then had always had a desire to, she was always really, is always, even now, everybody thinks she's my oldest sister. She's well polished, well turned out, and took pride in her appearance. My dad looks like a hippie, so when you look back, how on earth they ever got together in the first place, I don't know.
It was never going to work.
It
I'm
was
getting
never gonna.
real Meryl Streep from Devil Wears Prada vibes when you talk about your mum and Kath as well.
Yeah, I did
Um,
that, yeah.
so yeah. So what did you study at university, Bunty?
I went to, at the time it was a polytechnic. I went to, I think it's now the Manchester Met, but at the time it was the Manchester Polytechnic, and I studied business and fashion. And that was a 4-year degree, and one of the years there was 2 6-month placements. So one you automatically went into a factory environment, because that would, gave you the ground and the understanding of the origin of product, etc. And the second placement was essentially geared to, you needed to gear it to your ultimate aspiration, and my ultimate aspiration was buying. So I hated working in the factory, and that definitely gave me a sense of where I wanted to be. And I entered the buying department as an assistant buyer for Top Man at the time, owned by Ralph Halpin. I worked for a number of quite formidable women, actually. I think that at the stage I entered the industry, there were very few women in leadership roles. And the women that were in leadership roles had to work really hard. And they were quite firm leaders, they were quite strict. It nearly put me off my path. I won't mention who it was. I just decided, if that's what you have to be, that's how you have to behave, and that's the kind of demeanor you need to have to get on in this industry as a woman. That's not who I want to be. I don't want to be that person. And it was a buyer called Andy Cool who just said, you can be whatever version of that you want. Whatever you do, don't let somebody else's behavior and attitude put you off from being your version of a career path that you want to take, which was brilliant advice, because I think I was that close to saying, you know what, it's not for me. I'm not that person. I can't be that person. So I'm tapping out. So yeah, that was great advice.
Makes you think, though, back in, I suppose, would it have been the early, like, 90s that you were
It would have been late
stepping
80s. Late 80s.
late 80s? Yeah. It was really unusual for women in most industries to be in leadership roles, and it makes you wonder, actually, were they leading with authenticity? Was that really who they were, or were they having to put on this bravado or this facade to compete against their male peers? But yeah, it's amazing to hear that you also then sort of realized that you could lead with authenticity in your own way and not have to follow suit. So did you know from sort of your early 20s, when you started working for Topshop, that you were destined to become a leader? Was that a path that you were striving for, or was it more you were passionate about fashion? And I guess, that was really sexy in like late 80s, being able to get into Topshop. I mean, that's what you must have been the envy of so many of your peers on your business and fashion degree.
It was interesting because it was a really small course. So there was only 26 of us, I think, that actually graduated in the end. It started as 30. And I'd applied, we'd all had to apply for a placement. And I wanted to go back down to London from Manchester. I wanted to live at home during my placement. And it was Top Man, actually, Top Man and Radius, part of the Topshop group, or the Burton group, I think it was at the time, had positioned a placement opportunity, which I didn't get shortlisted for, because apparently my CV didn't look great. I hadn't perhaps sliced and diced it the way that they wanted it to. So I sent a separate letter to Kath Norgate, who was the controller, and one of the only controller, actually, only female controller within the group, and said, look, I'd really like to come and work for the business. And this was pre-internet, so I couldn't Google her or the business. I just knew what I knew from going into stores and things like that. And this is why I think that you should give me a shot. And she said the initiative of writing to her was the thing that made her think, actually, we should give her an interview. And she did. And so I got got the role, which was six months. And then at the end of it, they said, if you want to come back down to London once you've graduated, then there'll be a role for you here, which was amazing. So I think in answer to your question, at that point, I knew I wanted to be in business. I nearly didn't do fashion business, by the way. I nearly stayed in London. I wanted to get away from home because there were some challenges in the home at the time. I wasn't getting on with my stepfather. So I decided the best thing for me to do was to move as far away as I possibly could and carve out some independence, which is what I did. So Manchester, here I came. And the perfect time to be in Manchester, by the way, 1986, Happy Mondays, that whole scene was kicking off. So it was amazing. Madchester, as they called it. So yeah, I probably didn't realize I wanted to become a leader at that point. What I knew is I wanted to develop a career and I wanted to move through the ranks, whatever that looked like. And depending on the environment I was working in, it was either encouraged or it was actually discouraged. You were often overlooked certainly during the early 90s as a female even in the fashion industry. There was almost like you could become a buyer, but probably no more than that. There were very few controllers, as they called them, or buying managers at that point that were women. So yeah, I wanted to do, at the point I realized that was the path I wanted to take. It was more because I wanted to do a better job in leading teams rather than, or what I perceived a better job, i.e. try and take a more nurturing, collaborative direction and support leadership role rather than what was quite dictatorial at the time.
So what point did leadership start really featuring in your career story?
Probably, so my first job was at GUS Mail Order, and it was a graduate traineeship. And all of the senior roles were taken up by men, apart from one. And I was lucky enough to work under quite a formidable character called Carol. She was a senior buyer, and she was almost a feminist, in so much as you could be in that environment at that time. And she was always encouraging me to consider not accepting that ceiling as a buyer. She'd accepted it, but she was always encouraging me not to. And she'd accepted it because she wasn't a political player, so she had to accept that that's where she was topping out, because she wasn't prepared to schmooze or do the things that other people had to do to get by. She also encouraged me to consider getting out of that environment because she thought that I would be limited if I stayed in that environment, and she was right. As an assistant buyer, you had an admin, so that's when you start obviously having somebody reporting into you. And what I learned from Carol, I then started to impart on my admin, because admins wanted to be assistant buyers, and then they wanted to be junior buyers, and then they wanted to be buyers. And I guess some of that's about being a big sister as well, being a bit bossy, but also the role I played in my sister Sam's relationship and mine was about, trying to teach or nurture or support. So that kind of rubbed off in my first management roles, albeit, managing an admin. And I enjoyed doing that, actually, because I could see that you could manage people in a positive way. It didn't have to be negative. It could be encouragement. It could be showing and telling. It could be directing and supporting, and the right levels of direction and support at the right time. And so, yeah, I kind of at that point thought, well, actually, in the fashion industry, travel doesn't stop at buyership. As a buying manager or buying controller, you travel too. So, and that was my desire at the time, just keep traveling, but realizing that that could still be afforded me if I did decide to go into a more leadership role. So I left GUS, and that's when I got another role where I had 2 assistants, and that's again something that confirmed the fact that I wanted to sort of lead people and move my way up the ranks.
Did you have any sort of advocates or sponsors, qualifications that you were put on in terms of learning these management skills?
No, not at that stage. When I moved to Edinburgh Woolen Mills, it was a family-run business. It was owned by David Stevenson, and they were quite good at putting you on management courses. Not frequent, but it was all part of not necessarily the way that I learnt when I was at TK Maxx, because they have a brilliant succession planning program, and they're, being an American company, they're really good at succession planning, personal development plans, the whole structure within a one-to-one basis. So that's probably where I learnt most of the skills I have now and have transferred out of such a large organization into some of the smaller businesses I work with. But at that stage, access to courses, external courses, where you met people in different roles from different businesses, but still within the industry or similar industries. And then I had the privilege of working for David Stevenson directly, and he was an Olympic pole vaulter, I think. And so all of the discipline and the kind of mental stoicism that's required to be an Olympian, and how he really naturally led the business. Everybody knew who he was. He'd say hello to everybody. He wasn't this owner of a massive business. He was totally accessible. And because I worked for him for about probably a year and a half, I really enjoyed working with him and for him. And I think that he taught me entrepreneurialism, because he wasn't structured in his approach. He taught us to trust our gut and really hone senses outside of structured, prescriptive leadership courses. So
yeah, sounds like a real inherent skill that he had,
yeah,
that was a very natural leadership style that you could learn from.
yeah, and also being an ex-Olympian, the kind of the rigidity required to and the mental strength required obviously came naturally to him, but also then he could impart naturally what he'd learned through those disciplines.
You mentioned TK Maxx, and it's TJ Maxx, the American company, isn't it? I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a really exciting part of your career. And as you said, it's where you really developed your skills and kept progressively climbing the career ladder. Can you tell us about your journey at
Yeah,
TJ Maxx, please, Bunty?
I think because I'd worked for David in an entrepreneurial role within Edinburgh Woolen Mills, because we had a series of stores that we created. He decided he was going to create off-price stores, so that became a sort of calling card, I think, because TK Maxx had just landed in the UK. And originally when I interviewed for them, I decided I wanted to move back down to London because I was living in Scotland at the time. So I went through a series of interviews, and I interviewed for a children's wear role, and I had no experience in children's wear, so I didn't get the role. So I moved to a company called AIS, Associated Independent Stores, and I worked there for only a year. It's sort of almost like a stepping stone to get back down to London. And they called me again and said, look, we've got a menswear role. Would you be interested in interviewing for it? So I did, and I got the job, which was amazing. And I loved working in menswear. It was like one of my favourite sectors to work in. But it was interesting. Actually, the entrepreneurial spirit exists in all parts of the organisation, even, TJX in the States. It's something that's, positively encouraged. And what TJX and TK Maxx did was start the process of really honing in on your leadership skills and your negotiation skills. And so there was this real juxtaposition between creating an environment where you were wholly entrepreneurial. You had complete autonomy over the deals. You were writing checks as you were going into these deals and spending a lot of money, while being developed as an individual with the resource that the TJX operation had. And what they did is they basically blueprinted the development, succession planning, personal development plans out of the mothership, if you like, into this small environment, because they knew that ultimately off-price was going to go explode. And so they, from the very early stages, they drafted in a load of AVPs from the States to come and live in the UK for 2 to 5 to 10 years, even, to start training us at an early stage. And I guess if you wanted to put yourself forward to develop, you could. I actually left because I was overlooked for a position. And that's when I went and worked for Mulberry for 18 months, and then ended up coming back because my old boss had invited me back in a divisional role, working directly for the States, which was incredible. So I was heading up the European buying office, and that gave me access to the mothership directly. I would go over and spend every quarter, I'd spend at least a week there. I'd go into Canada, and I'd be exposed to all these brilliant leaders and just a really brilliant way of managing, nurturing, developing, supporting. And that, I think that was probably the first point at which I thought, this is the kind of leadership structure I want to be involved in, because culturally it feels right, and the behavior and the attitude of these leaders feels like it's the kind of leader I want to be. So yeah, that structure definitely supported my confidence, I think, to believe that with the right level of support and direction, I could become the leader I wanted to become. It's an amazing business in terms of the way that they are able to offer you the opportunity and then establish whether you are cut out to be the kind of leader that they want you to be.
What an incredible opportunity, Bunty. I think the retail sector is one of those sectors in the most part that seems to have got proper leadership development, right? I mean, we all sort of talk about the John Lewis partnership, M&S. They were always really renowned for their leadership programs as well. And certainly don't seem to do what a lot of industries do, it's promoting people into leadership roles, but not giving them the actual training, development and skills to execute their roles. So yeah, amazing. When you were sort of in the throes of your career at TK Maxx, your peers, was it a diverse peer group? Did you start to see more women coming through the ranks?
Yes, there was. So on our fashion floor, we had what was it? 3 of us were female, and 1 of them was gay. I hadn't seen that balance before in terms of diversity within that leadership team in any other business that I'd worked in. So then when you looked above that, and we had our VPs and our senior vice presidents, there were women in those roles. So yeah, that definitely much more diverse.
What was TK Maxx doing differently then to support, sponsor, encourage women? Because that is unique. It's unusual. It's not in every business you see that level of diversity. So what was their special formula for, because people don't just get there in those positions, do they? There's an awful lot of work that goes in. There's planning, it's years. It can take a really long time to get there. What did they do?
So I think initially it started because actually even at really senior level, we had a female president. So in the US, so that definitely influenced the cultural shift in terms of diversity. And maybe it was because at the time the Americans were just ahead of the curve, or maybe it was just because it was such a big business they could afford to explore a more diverse operation, if you like. But they had they were very open to encouraging women to come back to the workplace after they'd had children, and they were very open to accept that actually some of the most dedicated individuals within the team were women with kids, because they weren't always afforded the opportunity to continue their career once they had children. So actually what you were getting is not only a dedicated but very grateful workforce, because their entire life didn't get put on hold. They actually could go back into the role that they really loved as well. And then I think that I don't know that gender was ever a part of the discussions. I think that it was about your competences and skill sets. And so that, I think, creates a more level playing field, because it's actually, you're being interviewed for your skills and your competences and your abilities, not because of, what gender you are. So that probably is a big part of it, because what they were looking at doing as they were progressing people from assistant vice president upwards is essentially potentially always looking for the next president, whether it was male or female. They're constantly looking to develop people internally. Most buyers were female, even then. So actually, if you think about the pool that you had, it was almost necessity that you needed to find within that pool women who wanted to progress and make sure that you did everything you could to support them in that journey.
Yeah, I love hearing that, encouraging women to come back after they've started families. And, I'm sure in many industries they claim that they encourage it, but there's a difference between, encouraging it and actually making it a choice that, women can actually choose to come back. It's what are they actually doing to enable women to make that choice? What flexibility is there? Are there mentors in the business that are showing that you can operate at a senior level in the business, but also have a family at home? So yeah, that's really interesting. And obviously now you're doing your MD on a fractional basis type work, which is, I think there's such a market for this, like MD on demand, for especially these smaller entrepreneurial startups, that they need that level of experience, somebody who can come in and put the structure and the discipline and the systems and governance and all those things in place from some of those bigger organizations like TJX. What are you seeing now in your portfolio, I guess, about leadership and developing leadership skills within those businesses?
Most of my, my cutting my teeth as a managing director, outside of the leadership skill piece of it, which obviously came through TK Maxx. I was a managing director for a kids SPF swimwear brand for 5 years, and you have to obviously hone your skills in terms of looking to structure the team, structure personal development. So all of the stuff I took out of TK Maxx, I sort of put into that small business as well. But it also, it's a lonely place, being an MD of a business or an owner of the business. And so I was fortunate enough when I was at Sonova that Liz Earle was one of our shareholders, major shareholder, and she knew how lonely it was a place to be the head of a business. So if at any point I had any challenges or I just needed a sounding board, I could just pick up the phone to her and say, look, Liz, I've come across this. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever heard of this business? Except any conversation, her phone, she was open to always be there to support. Quite an incredible woman. And I can't tell you how fortunate I am to have had her during that journey, because she's a tour de force, but just a wonderful human being as well. And I think my experience of as an MD, acknowledging what a lonely place it was to be the head of a business. During COVID, the business folded, and I became available to be a part-time managing director. And what I realised was that a lot of the smaller businesses that really need structure, but also especially women. Most of the businesses I've worked with as a part-time managing director have been female-founded businesses. And not only is that a lonely place as a leader, but also then the imposter syndrome associated with being in that position. And so just having another woman who has been in a position where she's led a business for 5 years and acknowledging the fact it's a lonely place unless you've got someone wonderful like Liz, and then almost trying to create a role for myself as not just somebody to put structure in the business, not just somebody to establish what the team needs, where the gaps are, not just look at the financials and understand where there's fat or where we need to lean up, but also acting as a mentor or a coach or just a confidant for female founders. And that part of it, and I guess that's the DNA of having gone through the leadership training I had at TK Maxx, that part of it I really enjoy. I really enjoy sort of, trying to lift some of the founders, especially when you're on your own leading a business and it's times are tough, and it's really tough at the moment. Just having that feeling that you can just be a shoulder or just at the end of the phone, the way Liz was for me, as a sounding board, just to give confidence, just to create a forum in which it didn't matter what was said, it was safe. So I think that's a big part of my learning for what I'm doing at the moment has come through my role as a managing director and having access to someone like Liz.
It's a huge amount of pressure, and I think especially women, as you say, put that pressure on ourselves to be everything to everybody and carry all the emotions of your workforce, but think that we are superhumans and that's what we're meant to be able to do. We're meant to be able to do it all. It is a lonely place to be in that sort of buck stops role.
Yeah.
And having somebody that welcomes you to be yourself, be able to celebrate, commiserate, just talk about anything is such a useful confidant to have. So
and not fear mistakes. I mean, a big challenge that a lot of people do is they fear mistakes, and we were always taught that the mistakes were the richest learning curve, and it only becomes a crippling mistake if you've got if you're not prepared to step back and understand how he can learn, or head it on and come to the table with multiple or a solution, whatever. It only becomes a problem if you if you ignore it or you commiserate it. And we were always taught in TKs that you should celebrate success, but you should also spend as much more time unpicking where the failure or the mistakes were, because that's where you're going to learn the most. And we're all afraid to make mistakes, when in actual fact, it is going to be the thing that, if you think about success, not everything's successful all the time. So especially a female founded business where you're on your own and you worried everything's on your shoulders and everything, one mistake is going to topple everything. That's something that having the confidence of some of the women you work with, and someone like Liz unpicking for you is really helpful.
And what about the sort of support that you're giving to these founders on their responsibility going forward to make sure that they're building leadership teams and succession planning, and looking at diversity and bringing in leaders that they can actually develop and mentor and have for the future?
I think it's interesting because a lot of entrepreneurs haven't cut their teeth through a structure, if you like. It's a spontaneous opportunity or a problem that they've looked to solve and haven't necessarily come to the table with the skills to unpack how to develop a team internally. And so even in a smaller business, the first thing I do is look at resource and say, okay, where are our gaps, where are our challenges, and where are our potential stars within the business, and how do we champion them to feel like this is a place for them to stay, even in a small business. And while sort of structured training is always very enticing, especially in some of the businesses that you've mentioned, what you'll find is that often people who join a smaller business have an innate kind of entrepreneurial skill set themselves. And the challenge you face is, if they haven't had any training themselves, is how you hone that to build confidence and the right level of support and direction that gives them something to almost work to. And so even in small businesses, the first thing I do is just sort of understand what the team looks like, understand where the potential next layer is, whether that's senior leadership team or whether that's the next head of, or and then literally build personal development plans based on conversations that are, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What do you want out of this? Where do you think your challenges lie? Where do you think your strengths lie? And then if you can frame that in a plan that you just talk to every month, really simple, and it doesn't have to be a long conversation. It can be an hour, it can be 30 minutes, it can be 15 minutes, but make that a routine that makes everybody feel like they're developing, or at least spending some time on themselves to understand how they're developing or what additional support they need. And it's in a smaller business as well, where everybody works so closely as well. I like people to mentor each other as well. So, because actually someone else's, skill set could definitely be more accessible to someone at the same level and less intimidating. And often there's a lot of different diverse skills within the group that can be shared. But I think in a way, we're within the fashion industry, it is quite a female dominated environment anyway, where it is less dominated is at more senior leadership. But that is changing as well.
Yeah.
It has
Yeah.
to. It has to.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I've absolutely loved hearing about your career. And, when you first started talking about and sharing your early career story, I couldn't quite see how you navigated it and sort of ended up going down the fashion route. So that was so interesting. And I loved hearing about sort of London to Manchester, back to London again, and obviously all the global travel as well. I want to end with one question. If you were having a conversation with 15-year-old Bunty tomorrow,
Yeah.
what message would you want to tell her?
Ooh, I think have some belief in your ability. I think we weren't necessarily from a background where we were encouraged to go to university. So when I did, albeit it was a polytechnic at the time, I definitely doubted whether I could do, whether I had the brain to do it, or whether I was competent and capable. So I think it is sort of really unpick, challenging the doubt. And I think if you can take that from other people, i.e. listen to what other people have to say, or ask for help, or seek feedback, then that will help you unpick it more. And perhaps certainly when I was 15, that wasn't really something you didn't encourage. So I'm quite heartened that we're living in an environment, or certainly we're living in a lifetime where being open about your feelings, about your doubt or inefficiencies, or how you believe you're perceived, is much more openly discussed. That's quite encouraging.
And there's access to people, and people do want to help. But I think you're right. Back then, in the 80s, it was just not a thing. Well, thank you so much for joining me as a guest, Bunty, on Word on the Grid. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, and look forward to speaking to you again, Bunty.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.